Welcome back everyone. Let's go ahead and talk about the iPad Air 1 and see how it holds up in 2021. Now believe it or not, this iPad has been out since 2013. Now to give you some perspective, the iPad Air 1 came out the same year as the iPhone 5S. Now think about it like that. That is so crazy to me that this iPad is still kind of supported in a way. I mean, it got iPadOS 12.4.6. I think it got 12.4.7 as well or something like that, whatever it came out with. And that's still so insane to me that Apple is still pushing out support for an iPad that came out many, many years ago. So that's the very first thing. Now, I would not recommend picking up an iPad Air 1 anymore, especially when we have such great iPads for such cheap prices nowadays. So I'll go ahead and leave some of my other favorite iPads that I would recommend this year, the budget cheap ones, in the description below. You can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. Now starting off with the front of the iPad Air 1, as always, this thing still has that 9.7 inch IPS panel. And here's the best thing about this panel. It wasn't even a bad panel when it first came out. It just so happened that it did have kind of, a little like coating over the display. There was a gap in terms of the front panel and the actual display itself. So that kind of caused a lot of people, including me, to not like the panel, but the resolution was still pretty high. You had 1536 by 2048. That's actually a pretty high resolution panel, over full HD, but the PPI was still pretty low because it was such a massive panel. But at the end of the day, it's still a pretty good looking panel for the most part. And you have that, bezel in the front, the top and bottom bezel. You have the home button on the front as well. No Touch ID, no nothing like that. But I think for the most part, this iPad still holds up, at least on the front and the back. And when you pick up this iPad, the best thing about Apple, and one thing they've always done, perfected over and over and over again to all their iPhones, all their iPads, whatever, is that you can still pick up the iPad Air 1 and still feel like you're holding a very premium and modern machine. Even though this thing came out many years ago, it doesn't feel that old. Yeah, it looks kind of old and stuff like that, but it doesn't actually feel that bad. And that's one of the best advantages with these iPads. When you have an iPad like this, you're not necessarily going to feel like you have a bad panel or an ugly phone or an ugly tablet or anything like that. There's a lot of other things to complain about this iPad for, but the way it looks and the way it feels is probably not one of those things I'd complain about, to be completely honest. Now you have the lightning port on the bottom, the headphone jack as well, which is great, and on the back, the aluminum back, which, like I stated before, makes this iPad feel so much better. I mean, when you hold it, it just feels so good, and I've already talked about this for 40 minutes, but that is definitely one of my favorite aspects about this device for sure. Now you do have the single camera setup on the back as well, which I'll go ahead and hit on right now. It's a single 5 megapixel sensor, so it's a pretty low, camera. I mean, there's really not a crazy amount you can do. You can do full HD videos on the back, surprisingly. You have a 1.2 megapixel front-facing camera, and these cameras are pretty much made for FaceTime and those type of things. This camera is not made for people to go ahead and, film YouTube videos on, or to, make motion picture films or anything like that. This is a very straight, forward camera that's literally only there just for FaceTimes and stuff like that. And if you happen to have to, make video calls for work or something, then this thing will be able to handle it as well. But I think for the most part, this is a pretty basic camera setup, even for this year, considering the fact that the iPhone 5S that came out the same year also had an 8 megapixel camera on the back. So this thing had a lower end camera than that one, which doesn't really make too much sense to me. But at the end of the day, it's a very basic camera. There's really not a crazy amount going for it. So in terms of the camera setup, that really pretty much covers it up. Like, it's good for FaceTime calls and stuff like that, but for anything over that, it's probably not worth the time, to be honest. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up. Now I'll go ahead and hit on the software experience, battery life, and just everything surrounding those two things. And this thing, did start off with, surprisingly, iOS 7. It did end up getting all the way up to iPadOS 12, which I think was a pretty good spot for this thing to end off with. I'm actually pretty surprised that it even got up that far, but I'm glad it didn't get iPadOS 13 or iPadOS 14. Those things were kind of, strictly focusing more on the feature set more than the stability set, in my opinion. So when you have an iPad like this, you're going to be getting a pretty good version of software. But again, keep this in mind, it's a pretty outdated device. So, even in terms of the gestures that this thing has, the features and all that stuff, it isn't necessarily the best combination of the two, or of anything, because, it's kind of an older iPad. So that's a huge thing to keep in mind. It has a super old chipset inside of it. But I think for the feature set inside of it, for everything, I think that's the most surprising thing about the iPad Air 1, especially now in 2021, would be the fact that it's still kind of supported with software. I don't remember the last time we got a software update, but it can't be more than just like 2 months ago. And that's crazy to me. This thing went all the way from 2013 to even up until maybe even 2021. Like, it's insane to me how long of a lifestyle or how long of a life cycle this thing has had. So for sure, at the end of the day, the software surprisingly, is great. It just, isn't a performance heavy machine. Even the battery life is actually surprisingly great. I mean, this thing has an 8,600 milliamp hour battery inside of it, and that's a huge battery to have inside of an iPad like this. Now, granted, the software isn't super optimized for the hardware, in terms of, what the battery life is and all that stuff, and because it's so old, it's definitely degraded in the battery sense. But as I always state, and I said this before and I'll say it again, this is definitely one of the best advantages for this specific iPad is the software mixture with the battery. I just wish my battery was a little bit better. I wish, it was a little bit more optimized. But as I stated before, at the end of the day, this thing has a pretty good battery setup inside of it and a software mixture as well. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up. Now, ending it off with the performance, this thing did have that Apple A7 chip inside of it, a dual-core CPU, and 1 GB of RAM on all the models of this specific device. And as I said before, this iPad definitely didn't have the best mixture when it came down to the whole entire performance segment. It was pretty much the same performance that we had from the iPhone 5S, but it wasn't as great in my opinion because there were so many more pixels to push on this display, and even with the software that was on the specific device, even though it got software updates for quite a bit of time, it still doesn't mean it was, a perfect performing iPad. I had a lot of issues in terms of the stutteriness. I think as soon as you have an app or whatever, hooked up onto the display, so if you have, like Temple Run or whatever playing on the device, then you're going to be good. Even if you're, loading up Google Docs or whatever the case is, I think you're going to have an okay experience. But loading things up and the overall UI animations and stuff is a very weird process, and I really don't like it. Like, it's pretty glitchy, and even doing the gestures, it's pretty crazy in my opinion. So I will definitely tell you, if you're somebody who wants to go ahead and use this iPad as an everyday device, you're definitely going to run into some issues when it comes down to the performance segment. Now, is it the end of the world? Absolutely not. I think this thing still has, capability. I think the, feeling in the hand, as I said before, still feels pretty good. But I think when it comes down to the performance segment, it's pretty lackluster if I'm being honest. I do have to give it the benefit of the doubt though, because it is such an old device. But I think the iPhone 5S gives me a better feeling performance, for sure, than this specific iPad. So that really pretty much covers up everything I wanted to hit on. So is the iPad Air 1 still worth it in 2021? Well, this is what I'll tell you, and I've said this before, it's nothing new. When you go back this far to these iPads, it really just depends what your workflow is like. If you're somebody who wants to go ahead and use an iPad as a media consumption device, you want to play a bunch of games on it and all that stuff, you want to use it, from point A to point B and replace everything, your MacBook and stuff, you're definitely not going to get that from an iPad Air 1. You could potentially get it. It's still kind of supported with software, but it's just not going to give you a smooth experience. It's not going to get you a fast experience. It's going to get you a very lackluster experience when it comes down to the performance, hardware. Really, the best thing about it is the battery life, but even that may be a little bit of a hit or miss for a lot of people nowadays because of the software and because the battery health isn't that great. So those are big things to keep in mind. But if you're somebody who wants to use an iPad just to watch movies on, or you want to just use it as like a side device in case something breaks, or you just want to bring it with you just to do something that's only specific for an iPad, then I don't think it would hurt to buy this one. But still, I would recommend something like an iPad Air 3. That's like a really good iPad still. The lowest I would recommend is like an iPad Air 2 in terms of the Apple ecosystem for iPad Airs. The iPad Air 2 is the lowest I would go. I would not recommend picking up an iPad Air 1 in 2021 anymore. Like I said, the lowest I would go is something like an iPad Air 2 at the very least. Maybe like an iPad, 6th generation. Those iPads will definitely last you for quite a bit of time, and those are still really good machines to pick up as well. So, as stated before, I'll leave my top picks this year for any iPads that I would recommend for the budget price in the description below. You can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. But that's really pretty much it. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section as well. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it means so much for you guys to hit that. Also, check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my other channels. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.